Hello and welcome to today's video. One of the problems of studying the Prelude as a GCSE text is the fact that Wordsworth is asking this question in his poem: should we be ashamed of sexual desire? So one of the problems is our perception of history. So we associate sexual freedom with the modern age. We see it um, beginning in the 1960s, really, and then you've got the hippies and free love, and suddenly you've got the modern world we live in. And before that, we see the world as restrained and ashamed of sexual desire. And if we go back to the Victorians from 1819 to 1901, we probably imagine that people were still sexually active, but it was frowned upon to have affairs. People might have, or men rather, might have used prostitutes, but this was kept secret. If you're studying Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you'll be familiar with this. But the problem is that Wordsworth's actually born in 1770, uh, 39 years before Queen Victoria actually came to the throne. And sexuality in the 1700s was much, much different to the Victorian time, and in fact, much more permissive than it is now. So if you were a man with any kind of wealth in the 1780s, for example, or even the 1750s, you'd have a much different view to sexuality than the Victorians and even than today. So being a courtesan, which was a mistress, but a paid for mistress, um, but an openly paid for mistress, this was considered a career, was not a social disgrace in those times. It was quite common for attractive, reasonably well-educated women to set themselves up as the companions of rich men, and for rich men to acknowledge this, not to keep them hidden away in a flat somewhere that nobody knew about, but actually to go about town, to the theatre, to restaurants, to horse racing, wherever it was, and to take their courtesan and mistress with them. Men did not hide their use of prostitutes. It was considered relatively normal, and there would be a lot of sympathy for the prostitute, because it would be seen as a role created by men for their own pleasure, and the women would not be frowned upon. They wouldn't be social outcasts. And for wealthy men, there was no need to hide this from their wives. Now we can extrapolate from this all kinds of relationships that must have occurred in these times, including threesomes or menage a trois, as they were called, and a completely different attitude to sexuality than we have today. And if you look at written records, men would begin experiencing sex much younger, and not necessarily with people their own age. And this wasn't considered unusual at all. So now we've had that brief background, you might say, well, if Wordsworth predates Queen Victoria, then obviously his poem wouldn't be about being ashamed of sexual desire. Well, there are two reasons why it might. One is that the poem wasn't really published until much later in his life. In fact, it was finally published on his death at the age of 80, and he kept it private. So there are details in it which are private to him, um, possibly about his sexuality, and also if he did become ready to publish it by the Victorian times, any discussion of sexuality could no longer be open because times had changed and people were much more repressed. So we've also got a historical reason for him not publishing later in life. So I'm going to take you into the poem in a minute, and you need to understand the difference between sensuality and sexuality. So sensuality is an enjoyment in any physical sensation, and when Wordsworth is describing nature, you will see how sensual his descriptions are. However, those same descriptions can be viewed through a sexual lens, and we can see it as a reference to his sexual awakening. So his sexual desires are paralleled by the sensual description of nature. So nature is described as her. If you read the part of the poem before this extract, you'll see that the her here refers to nature, not to the boat. It's not the boat that's led him to her. It's nature who's led him to this female form of the boat. Now, this is perhaps a sexualization of nature, certainly giving her a female identity, although that would have been common at the time. Then you've got this idea of him loosening the chain that's tying the boat up. But the language of this is also reminiscent of the kind of language you'd use to describe taking somebody's virginity or stopping them being chaste. If you think of a chastity belt, this is being referenced here. So there's an idea of sexual freedom presented straight away in the description of how he steals the boat. We also have it as an act of stealth. This is hidden sexual desire, if you like, and that's emphasized again by his troubled pleasure. So he's getting a sensual or sexual delight that is also troubled by this. It troubles his conscience. Is he stealing something, i.e. somebody's virginity, without permission? Or you might take a Christian view and say, is he having sex outside of marriage in his imagination here, and therefore feeling guilty about this? But of course, let's not forget, he's not actually describing the sex act in itself here. He's using his description of nature to allude to his awakening sexuality. He's not coming clean with it because it is repressed. The language he uses to describe the boat is, I think, intentionally sexual. So he presents obviously the boat as female, but Elfin gives her a kind of fantasy element, something that would be deeply attractive to the imagination. But then he chooses to name the boat not as a bark, but as a pinnace. This is a small sailboat, but of course he didn't have to make it a small sailboat. In fact, when we read on, he's rowing it, isn't it? There's no reference to a sail at all. So this is, I think, a bit of a ruse. It's not a pinnace because it's a sailboat. It's a pinnace because this is a homophone for penis. So he's quite deliberately using words that push us towards a sexual interpretation. And then you can see the juxtaposition of pinnace and lustily, where he makes that link far more obvious. Then, of course, you've got the description of him rowing, but we can easily read that. So we could read, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, as a kind of metaphorical symbol for sexual experience here. And then the description of his actions as he rows, as I rose upon the stroke. There's a clear double meaning of stroke here, as in each each attempt at intercourse, if you like, and then heaving through like a swan. Heaving through is obviously in the same semantic field of the sexual act here, and the simile of like a swan is really interesting because it links this first sexual awakening with the idea of marriage. Swans are famous in poetry and romantic literature as symbols of loyalty. A swan famously stays with its mate for the whole of its life. And so there's an idea of a contract here, which is odd because I've just been telling you about how this society was sexually much more permissive, and yet Wordsworth appears to be looking at this original sexual encounter with nature as a marriage for life. So if we jump out of the sexuality and not think of it as sex with a human being, what he's describing here metaphorically is his relationship with nature. So nature is so real to him and so seductive that it's like having an affair with a woman you desire. And that's a relationship which is going to last him for his whole life. So that's the romantic view. The alternative view is that he's using this description of nature to relive sexual experiences, in fact, his early sexual experiences, the ones that have influenced him for life. And we'll come back in a minute to look at his actual relationships to see how this interpretation might pan out. Um, we've then got some almost schoolboy references here, bringing us back to the penis. So he's actually describing a mountain, of course, but he's using language that can be used to describe, in a schoolboy way, someone's boast about their own penis. So it's a huge peak, and it upreared its head. Okay, well, there is lots more sexual imagery if you want to go digging for it, but I think I've given you enough of a flavour there. We now need to look at this sense of perhaps guilt, but certainly troubled pleasure that you mentioned earlier. So he keeps thinking about this moment when he's apparently just stolen the boat and returned it, whereas metaphorically he's been talking about this sexual relationship. And he says it worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. This because these modes of being are unknown, he doesn't define them. Um, but one unknown mode that we're going to look at in a minute is the idea of incest, um, and the possible relationship he had with his sister. Um, that would explain his sense of guilt and unease. Um, and of course, if he were to pursue a love for his sister in a sexual way, that would explain why these are huge and mighty forms that trouble him. These forms do not live like living men because even in a permissive sexual society like the 1700s, incest would not be permitted. It would be something that's kept hidden and not exposed to public knowledge. Um, and they moved through the mind by day. Now, this is quite interesting. If it is an incestuous relationship, it would explain why his waking thoughts are also troubled, because he actually lived with his sister. It wouldn't be a memory he could escape from. It would be something that was there in front of him every day and a trouble to his dreams at night. So I was very skeptical of this idea of incest. But there's a reasonably recent book, The Ballad of Dorothy Wordsworth, written by Francis Wilson, that does look exactly at this relationship and claims that it was a lifelong incestuous one. And then there's a review by James Fenton, who's a bit of an expert on Wordsworth, in The Guardian. You can find it there, where he writes about this book. So the key piece of evidence is a notebook that Dorothy kept herself, which is published. But when we get to the description of the night before Wordsworth's wedding, it's heavily crossed out, and in fact has caused quite a few problems with interpretation. So she says, I gave him the wedding ring with how deep a blessing. I took it from my forefinger where I had worn it the whole of the night before. So she's gone to bed with it the night before, kept it on her finger. He slipped it again onto my finger and blessed me fervently. So it's a wedding ring. You put it on the finger of your bride. So many people have looked at this and thought, actually, symbolically, what he's doing here is he's marrying his sister. So he's telling her symbolically that they will still be, if you like, husband and wife, even when he's married to someone else. This is an extraordinary interpretation, but there are other biographical details to help us out. It might have been, instead of blessing her, that he blessed the ring softly. But even so, that would then symbolize the contract of marriage, which again he's making with his sister rather than with his wife. Okay, well, what are the other autobiographical details? Well, firstly, she does not go to the wedding. She's right there. She's with her brother, but she refuses to go to the wedding. And then, secondly, she goes on the honeymoon with her husband and his new wife, Mary. These are very strange details indeed, and certainly an incestuous relationship would help to explain them. Well, a modern reader might go back to the poem and say, no, you're reading too much into this. This repression shown by the quotations in yellow could just be a result of um, his own criticism of his sexual desire. It doesn't have to be particular sexual acts. We don't have to bring incest into it. He's just ashamed of becoming sexually active in a society that represses that. Well, here is the problem. Um, Wordsworth didn't grow up in a repressive society. In fact, he was in France just before the French Revolution. And while he was there, he had a mistress. The mistress got pregnant, um, and he wasn't able to see his daughter because he had to flee to England during the Revolution, but in fact returned back to France with Dorothy. So he takes Dorothy back to France and meets his mistress and his daughter Caroline, his mistress Annette. And why he goes there is twofold. One, to tell her that he can't marry her. In fact, he's going to marry Mary, which he does as soon as he gets back to England. But the other interesting detail is he appears to buy his wedding ring while he's out in France in Calais. Um, and Dorothy is intimately involved with this. So she clearly knows about his mistress. Um, it's public knowledge in Wordsworth's family. It wasn't hidden within the family. So there isn't any sexual shame attached to his sexuality here. You know, he's quite happy for the world to know that he's got what would have been called a bastard in the day. You know, a child born out of wedlock. He's happy to know that he's had a mistress. Um, these things are not problematic for him. So therefore, when we return to the poem, we have to ask, well, what is the apparent cause of this shame? These huge and mighty forms which appear to trouble him. Um, and when I started reading this poem, I assumed that incest would be much too fanciful, that there isn't enough historical evidence, and it was overreaching the interpretation. But now I've studied it in a bit more detail, and I've looked a bit more at the history. I think you could make a case. Anyway, you don't have to in your response. You can merely talk about the sensuality of his language. You can talk about the language being seductive. You don't have to refer to sexuality, of course. And if you do, you could just refer to it as being repressed. Um, or you could link that repression to his guilt over the possibly incestuous relationship with his sister. Well, I hope you found that informative, and if you want more, don't forget to subscribe. Good luck.